Every month, your body bleeds for almost a week. This happens over and over for nearly your entire adult life. Today it's simple. You just go to the store, buy a pack, use it, and forget about it. But your ancestors never had that kind of ease. For roughly 300,000 years of human history, there was no packaging, no factory, and certainly no aisle to choose from. And yet, every woman who ever lived, in every era, faced the exact same problem you face today. So how did they manage it? Here's the interesting part. Even now, archaeologists still can't fully answer that question. Not because the answer doesn't exist, but because the materials themselves erase their own trace. Cloth rots, moss decomposes, wool falls apart over time. In other words, the very things ancient women used to handle menstruation are the same things that vanish from the earth after just a few centuries, sometimes just a few years. So historians have had to piece this story together, not from the objects themselves, but from what people once wrote about them. And it turns out, people were writing about this a very long time ago. There's an ancient Egyptian medical scroll called the Ebers Papyrus, dating back to around 1550 BC. It's considered one of the oldest surviving documents on women's health. Egyptians at the time had linen, they had papyrus, both cheap, both available everywhere. It's very possible women rolled or folded these materials to absorb menstrual blood. Softened papyrus could be shaped into a small internal roll, not unlike a modern tampon. Of course, no one has ever found an intact artifact to prove it with total certainty. Move a little further, to ancient Greece, and the trail becomes much clearer. There was a physician named Cyrannus of Ephesus who lived around the 2nd century CE. He left behind one of the most detailed surviving records on gynecology from the ancient world. In it, he described how people used soft strips of lint, wrapped around a small piece of wood, then inserted internally to absorb blood. Helen King, a classicist who has spent decades studying ancient Greek writing on women's bodies, has pointed out that the Greeks didn't shy away from menstruation at all. They documented it carefully, the same way they documented digestion or fever. Try to picture it for a moment. A woman in ancient Athens, going to the market, carrying water, sitting at her loom, just an ordinary day. Underneath her tunic, a strip of softened wool or linen, folded neatly, held in place with a simple cord or belt. No adhesive, no elastic, just cloth, folded by hand, washed by hand, used again and again, year after year. By the time of Rome, much of Greek medical knowledge had been inherited, and wool became the material of choice across the empire. Wool holds moisture well, and it was already something found in nearly every home, since every household spun and wove its own cloth. Roman women likely used similar strips of it, changed, washed with water, then reused, the same object, serving the same purpose, month after month, sometimes year after year. But here's where the story stops, belonging only to Greece, Rome, or Egypt. It becomes something universal, something shared by all of humanity. Across cultures that never had any contact with one another, people arrived at almost identical solutions. In medieval Europe, women used old strips of cloth, folded and tied in place. Some historians even believe the English phrase, "on the rag," comes from exactly this habit. Sarah read, "A historian who studies menstruation in early modern England has documented how women there used cloth pads, sometimes called clouts, pinned into their clothing and washed after use. It was such an ordinary object that almost no one bothered to record the details." In North America, many indigenous communities used softened, tanned animal hide, or in some regions, dried moss. Moss was valued for one simple reason: it absorbed liquid extremely well without falling apart. Sphagnum moss in particular can hold many times its own weight in water, which is also why, for centuries, it was used to dress wounds. In Hawaii, people gathered fibers from the native fern, dried them, and shaped them for the same purpose. In parts of East Africa, some communities used rolled grass or the soft inner bark of certain trees. In every case, the material only had to meet one requirement. It needed to absorb well, and more importantly, it needed to be close at hand. And here is the most surprising part of this whole story. None of these materials were makeshift solutions, and they certainly weren't reckless improvisation. They were solutions refined across generations, passed down from mother to daughter, the same way people pass down the skills of tanning hide or weaving cloth. A woman in Rome and a woman from an indigenous community in North America, separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years, arrived at answers that were nearly identical. Not because they learned from one another, but because the human body poses the same problem everywhere, and human ingenuity tends to arrive at similar answers, no matter where it starts. Speaking of which, there's something that makes this story even more of a mystery, not less. Archaeologists have dug up pottery from ancient trash heaps. They've found sandals still intact in dry caves. They've even found 4,000-year-old Egyptian bread, still recognizable as bread. And yet, direct evidence of menstrual materials is almost non-existent. Not because ancient people didn't use them, but precisely because these materials were used exactly as intended, worn, washed, reused, until they finally fell apart completely, leaving nothing for a shovel to uncover thousands of years later. Which brings up an interesting thought. The absence of evidence is, in its own way, a kind of evidence. It tells us these objects were considered completely ordinary, everyday items, used and discarded in the truest sense. Not sacred, not ceremonial, not something anyone felt the need to preserve. That very ordinariness is exactly what makes them invisible to archaeology, but it's also what makes this story feel so deeply human. So what changed? The disposable pad you know today didn't actually appear until the early 20th century. During the First World War, nurses noticed that the cellulose material used in surgical bandages absorbed blood far better than ordinary cotton. Within just a few years, companies picked up on the idea and began producing it commercially. Before that moment, and it really was just a brief moment compared to the full span of human history, every woman who ever lived handled this the same fundamental way. Cloth, fiber, moss, wool. Cut, folded, washed, reused. Generation after generation, quietly solving the same problem with whatever the world around them provided. You stand at the very end of an unbroken chain, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Every woman before you found her own way through this. Every single month, in every culture, on every continent, someone was quietly solving this without a single manufactured product, without plastic, without a store, using nothing but her own hands and a quiet kind of resourcefulness. If stories like this interest you, subscribing to the channel will help you catch every next topic, these small but deeply human pieces of our shared history. Every month, your body bleeds for almost a week. And now, perhaps you'll look at it a little differently. Because for nearly the entire span of human history, the answer was never something bought. It was made, by hand, by the same quiet resourcefulness that carried humanity through the Ice Age, through famine, through everything else that ever.